Welcome to you online. Thanks for joining. It's kind of fun to start off a new semester of rough cuts. This is the first one. And by the way, I'm Andy Hansen with the Ecology Department and IOE. Part of what IOE is up to is trying to foster new types of research among faculty in different departments, interdisciplinary research. And we got to thinking about, for younger scientists, the barriers and opportunities for interdisciplinary research may have evolved from when some of us came in. And so really this set of rough cuts is really aimed at trying to get the perspective, particularly of earlier career faculty, on what they see as ways to help facilitate interdisciplinary research, ways that will work for them. And this will help inform the way that IOE can best benefit new faculty. And so it's really wonderful to have Andrew Felton as the first speaker in the series. Andrew's in land resources and environmental sciences. He's an ecosystem ecologist working on climate effects on ecosystems. And with that, I'll let Andrew take it from here.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for inviting me. No, I'm gonna have to click it. Yeah, so when I was thinking about interdisciplinary work and what it means to me, this, I would say almost a truism, but this idea of things being greater than the sum of their parts came to mind. And I'm a huge music fan. It's probably my first love. And so one of the first things that came to mind is the Beatles. I think they're a great example of individuals who came together and what they created, some of the really the greatest melodies and songs in popular music. They did that by not just virtue of their individual talents, but how they collaborated and worked together. I mean, I wouldn't say George Harrison's the greatest guitarist of all time. I wouldn't say Ringo's the greatest drummer of all time, but something happened when they came together that made them so special. And I think that's also shown by they had nice solo careers, but it was nothing like the Beatles. And a part of this too, what I'm going to talk about, is people drawing from different disciplines or ideas, or even different artists or scientists. And the Beatles were really influenced by these 1950s artists such as Chuck Berry and Little Richard. They sought to emulate them, so they're extracting that into their art. The same could be said for Led Zeppelin. I mean, you have, this is my favorite band. This won't all be about music, by the way. I'm trying to broaden the scope of this idea. You have these people coming together to create something really amazing. You could say this about sports too. I'm also going to talk about sports. So with the 1990s Bulls, one of the greatest teams of all time, it's necessarily a team endeavor, and what they're able to achieve together was a function also of their individual talents. I mean, you have the greatest scorer of all time, Jordan, one of the best power forwards, Pippen, and the greatest rebounder of all time, Rodman, but it's also how they interacted with each other to create such a dominant team. And so that's the first thing when I think about interdisciplinary work. It's working with others to create something that's greater, that will be greater than the sum of its parts. There's something about those interactions that can create these emergent properties or outcomes that are special. But this also applies for individuals. And so this will get into this idea of creativity. So if you think about Bob Dylan, another music example, he was more of a poet and a folk artist, drawing from Woody Guthrie. I believe he renamed himself after Dylan Thomas, the poet. His real name's Robert Zimmerman. He's from Minnesota like me, so we're proud of that. But what he did was he took those, the storytelling and poetry of folk music, and he applied it to rock and roll. So when there's a video of him at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, where he whipped out his electric guitar and everybody was losing their minds out of anger. He's the biggest star at this festival, and they're booing him. But what he did was he elevated rock and roll and brought a sense of heightened artistry, I would say, to that form, and that's why he's so revered as a songwriter. So here's a science example, which I assume you came to see, some stuff about science. If you think about Darwin, and yes, he went to the Galapagos, but he spent about 30 years writing that book. And when I read it, and it's fascinating that he draws on all these different disciplines. So he draws on ideas from Thomas Malthus, this economists, demographers, had these ideas about population growth. He takes ideas from Charles Lyell, this geologist, about the long time scales over which phenomenon progress. And does anybody know what the first chapter of his Origin of Species is about? Or how he frames his argument? He talks about agriculture, which I thought was quite clever. He essentially says we've been doing this sort of selection for 10,000 years. It's just self-evident. I thought he was going to go straight into biology and his observations on the Galapagos, but he's very careful, and he frames the argument drawing from agriculture. And so this is also what I think about interdisciplinary work, is that you're taking ideas from different disciplines to create something new. That's kind of the essence of creativity, and that's a big facet of interdisciplinary work that I think about. And so I've talked about Bob Dylan, Michael Jordan, the Beatles, Charles Darwin. So naturally, I'm going to talk about myself now. It's kind of the next progression in that sequence. So who am I? Right now, I'm a plant and ecosystems ecologist. And right now, as of today, my goal as an ecologist is to understand how climate-driven changes in water availability impact ecosystems that are already water limited. So how will drought intensification impact terrestrial ecosystems across the western United States, with an emphasis on grasslands, rangelands, shrublands, systems that we generally think of that their function is limited by the availability of water, both in space and time. And I was thinking, well, I'm supposed to talk about interdisciplinary work. So what do I do? Well, this is a schematic you'll find on my website where I try to break down kind of how I think about things. So because we're talking about climate, and precipitation is a dimension of climate. So we break down precipitation and how it may change into the future. Well, we have these different time scales. We have decadal trends. Some areas may get wetter and drier. Underneath that, we have interannual variability. Some years are wet, some years are dry. And on a day-to-day basis, weather also varies, and ecosystems are sensitive to that. So we have these different time scales that we care about, that I care about. And I'm interested in looking at responses across different levels of biological organizations. So because I study plants, I'm interested in things such as individual leaf physiology, local scale population and community dynamics, and also landscape and regional impacts of these changes in climate. So that already necessitates a broad suite of tools and perspectives. You have to use tools from plant ecophysiology, experimental ecology and field ecology, and remote sensing, GIS, and data science. So that got me thinking, well, ecology is almost this hodgepodge of these different disciplines. So already to do this work that I'm interested in, it necessitates being, to a certain extent, interdisciplinary. So ecology draws on bits and pieces of all these disciplines, and then I got thinking, well, you can break down biology into a million different things too. There's all these sub-disciplines, and my head was about to explode trying to categorize everything. And to do ecology, I have to draw on tools from GIS, statistics, data science. Data science itself is this new field that uses statistics, so that could be enmeshed in there. I didn't know what to put there, so I also realized I've mostly just been working with power tools, doing ecology, building stuff, and doing experiments. So already to be an ecologist, you have to be quite interdisciplinary. You have to be interested in doing that already because it's such a broad field. So I wanted to unpack a little bit about some of what has worked and some of the more challenges I've had with this interdisciplinary type of work I've done so far in my career, going from more small scale constrained collaborations to attempts to do really transdisciplinary work. And hopefully I have some insights. I realize I don't have any amazing recommendations for how to rectify some of these challenges I've faced, but I think those challenges are kind of interesting in and of themselves. So starting at a small scale type of example, back during my PhD, it was really focused on this question of how will precipitation extremes impact grassland functioning. And this is almost like a two-person collaboration with Mindy Smith over at Colorado State University. So it's two ecologists talking to each other, two grassland ecologists thinking about this question. And if you've gone to one of my talks before, I've probably shown you this, but this is one way we understand how grasslands might respond to climate variability. So on the y-axis there, we have above ground net primary production. You can think of that as plant biomass production. And then we have a weather variable on the x-axis. So we have here growing season precipitation. And this is observational data relating the yearly value in precipitation to the yearly value in production. It's a temporal relationship or a temporal model. So some would say it. But we realize that there's limitations to this temporal model, this approach. The first thing is just the sheer time and labor you need with long-term data collection. So to get 11 years of data takes quite a bit of work. Each year is a data point. And things in the environment are changing through time, so it's a lot of work. To get generally what we see in grasslands is a linear relationship. You get more water, grass grows more. It's kind of a cynical way to put it. But there's limited representation of extreme years in these types of models or relationships, partly because there's just not a ton of years in those data sets. And extreme years are by definition rare. So there's kind of this uncertainty about, well, if you get a really extreme year, how would this change your understanding of how the system responds to this weather variable? Maybe that relationship would shift from linear to saturating. And that's important in terms of how we project out into the future, because we're expecting to see greater frequencies and magnitudes of climate extremes, extreme drought and deluges and these things. So there could be two kind of nonlinear outcomes. You could have a situation here where the main point is that when you include those extreme years, what you actually find is what I'm calling a positive asymmetric relationship, which just means that what you find is that the ecosystem is actually relatively more responsive to those wet years than to those dry years. So there's an asymmetry there going on. And that's important in the long term, because if you get those extreme fluctuations, that would actually increase average productivity through time, because it's responding more to those wet years than it's being reduced in those dry years. This is called Jensen's inequality. It's not really important you know that, but that's what it's called. And then you can have the converse of that. You can have a negative asymmetric relationship where after including those extremes, you find that the ecosystem is actually reduced more during extreme drought than the process is increased during those extreme wet years. And so if you have increased fluctuations of extreme years over time, because its ecosystem function is being reduced more during drought, that would reduce that ecosystem process over the long term. So that's one reason why it's important, but just trying to get across the point that there could be nonlinear outcomes after including those extremes. So there's this paper that came out by Catherine Cottingham, who's over at Dartmouth, and she's a quantitative aquatic ecologist. And she had a really interesting idea about rethinking how we do ecological experiments, manipulative experiments. She simply just suggested that when you have these continuous variables, do a design that emphasizes the gradient in those variables. Don't do these two-factor designs. And I'll highlight that here. So if we think about traditional climate change experiments, typically what you're going to see, like for drought, is that you'll have a drought and a control treatment. So you'll have these two treatments, and these treatments will be relatively well replicated. So you'll have few treatment levels, and then you'll have high replication. And so what Catherine Cottingham suggests is that because these potentially could be continuous variables, she didn't specifically suggest this, but if you have two continuous variables of interest, such as water and plant productivity, why not emphasize the gradient and pose what she called a regression design? And this regression design sacrifices replication for treatment levels. So here's an unnecessary animation, but you have more treatment levels and a gradient of that treatment, but you're reducing the replicates per each level. So you're imposing a treatment gradient. And we thought that was a cool idea. Apparently, a lot of people hadn't picked up on it at that point, or didn't want to do it, or thought these ANOVA-based designs, which is what she called them, were safer. But being young and naive, potentially, and I don't know, I thought it was interesting. We decided to apply that idea to understanding this question about how precipitation extremes might impact that relationship between primary production and precipitation. Would it shift to a saturating or some sort of nonlinear relationship? So what I did was I built this experiment out at the Kanza Prairie at one site. So this is the whole experiment. You could say it's large scale or small scale. Now I would say it's small scale because I do regional scale work. But I built this experiment, and what I did was I imposed a gradient of precipitation amounts on the ecosystem. And so on the y-axis here is precipitation added, and on the x-axis is a percentile from the 110-year record. And that extended from the first percentile to the 99th percentile. I imposed this in a single growing season. And what we found, well, first of all, luckily it did translate to some extent into impacts on soil moisture, which is a much more mechanistic metric of water availability than precipitation. But what we found was that even after including those extreme values, that we weren't really able to find strong evidence that some nonlinearity emerged. So on the y-axis here is that above ground net primary production, and on the x-axis is that growing season precipitation. And so even after including extreme precipitation values in here, we didn't see that predicted shift in any sort of nonlinear outcome. This grassland was quite responsive to those fluctuations in precipitation. And I did this in 2 separate years, and I also did it over in the shortgrass steppe in Colorado, and it was a similar outcome. So these grasslands are quite responsive to precipitation. And this is a small scale example, I think, and a successful example of applying somebody's kind of unique thinking or different idea about experimental design in a new context. And I would say it was a successful outcome, and it tested what we were after. So it was pretty smooth collaborating with another ecologist. But then during my postdoc, I got a little more ambitious, I suppose, in terms of scope. So this is inherently a bigger question. How will climate change impact forage production across these different Western U.S. rangelands? So the Western U.S. is comprised generally of these different rangeland types. And we wanted to know if we could project out into the future how climate change would impact these systems. And this was a slightly larger collaboration. So Peter Allen, here's Michael Jordan. I'd say he's the ringleader. Bob Schreiber, he's over at University of Nevada, Reno. He was really the quantitative powerhouse. And then there's me, I guess, kind of the misfit who does the dirty work and gets the job done, like Dennis Rodman. And there were others too. I'm being kind of cheeky here, but there were probably 10 people involved with this project. So we're expanding the scope of the work, and we're expanding the amount of collaborators from ecologists, ecohydrologists. We didn't really extend beyond that for this particular part. It's still mostly ecologically minded people, just more people with diverse perspectives within ecology. And so what we did, because this was a bigger question, we had to use a different data source and different tools. So we used remote sensing data of net primary production up there up top, and then gridded meteorological data. So, you know, there's tens of thousands of pixels in each, and each pixel has maybe 30 or so years of data. So it's spatio-temporal. And our ultimate goal is to produce a map of how forage production, the proxy here being net primary production, how that would respond or change out into the late century, being forced by changes in climate. So that's what we're focused on, changes in climate and how that would impact forage production. So just an overview of our approach, we had that historical forage production data that varies both through time in a pixel and across space, across pixels. And for the same spatio-temporal resolution, we have weather data. So we can use those to build a relationship a spatiotemporal relationship between weather and forage production. So we built a statistical model, and then what we did was we ran the late century, like 2069 or something through 2100. We ran that through that model to get projected forage production in the late century. And for each of those 5 or 6 ecoregions, we had a different model, but it was the same idea. And viewed another way, because we have space and time for climate here, what we did was for a pixel, you have this for a weather variable, here being temperature. And so because we have a spatiotemporal data set, what we did was we decomposed that weather into its average and the interannual deviations around that average. So for a given pixel, you have the mean value of, let's say, temperature, and then you have the interannual deviations. From year to year, it could be a warm or cool year, and for precipitation, it could be a wet or a dry year. But what's important here is that we have, in our model, we have both mean climate varying across space, and for every pixel, we have an interannual deviation. So that was how we went about our covariates in this approach. And it seemed so simple. It was like, okay, so let's just run the future weather through these statistical models we built, and then we'll get future forage production. And then it will be, then it will be great. And then I asked what I thought was a stupid question. It was like, how do you represent the future mean in terms of climate? We realize you're faced with a decision when you're projecting out into the future, at least with our approach. You could represent the mean in terms of mean temperature or mean precipitation. You could represent it as the historical mean, or you could represent it out as the future mean. So if you just kept the mean the same, you assume that you use the historical mean temperature or precipitation, and then you fed the future weather data through that, your model would be dominated by these deviations. So you get these really high deviations in temperature dominating the model. And we call that a time series approach. And this results in what we call maximum disequilibrium. And that's signified just by how large these red bars are. So in the future, because the temperature gets warmer, if you keep in your model the mean temperature at its historical mean, and then you feed through it the future temperature, that's going to look really hot to the model. However, if you decide to represent mean climate as the late century mean, then those deviations become quite small. And your model actually becomes dominated or responds mostly to changes in mean climate. And we called that minimum disequilibrium. So in this first one, it's the interannual deviations that are dominating the projections because they're so big in the future. But in this one here, it's the changes in mean climate that are dominating the projections because you're automatically adjusting the mean to the future, and then your deviations are quite a bit smaller. And we realize this carries with it ecological assumptions. So if your model is dominated by those changes in mean climate, you're actually using what we call a spatial gradient approach or a spatial model. And this is from an old paper, early 90s, that relates above ground production to annual precipitation. And so there's two ways you can do this. You can do it through relating it to mean production, to mean precipitation across space. So that's that spatial model. And the assumption here is that as you go across, the ecosystems are equilibrating to that average climate. So it's representing average changes in production from the shortgrass steppe to the tallgrass prairie. So production is tracking the average climate. However, if you use a time series approach, that's one site, production at one site responding to interannual variation in weather through time. So the site, the composition of the vegetation, these things are not changing. And that's the decision we made with how to represent future climate in terms of the mean in our model was connected to these relationships here. So if we use that time series approach, where we keep the mean at its historical mean and let the interannual deviations dominate the signal, we get maximum disequilibrium in climate in the future. However, if you choose to represent the mean as its future value, the future mean in late century mean, then it's that spatial gradient approach dominating the signal, and you get pretty small disequilibrium with climate. So the study shifted to trying to understand the implications of that. Because if you use this approach, you're assuming that rangelands they're not adjusting to changes in climate at all. They're just remaining as is. It's like putting a rangeland from 2000 into a climate in 2100 or something. Versus if you use this, you're assuming that these rangelands are tracking climate pretty fast. So when we made our projections, we found that if rangelands in the future do not track climate at all, there's maximum disequilibrium, you get widespread projections of losses in forage production. This is linear extrapolation, but it's just like goes to show that, particularly in the Southwest, like they probably can't support rangeland production systems in that scenario. However, if these rangelands can track climate change, then actually you see something quite different. You see that actually forage production increases in a lot of places. It still decreases in some places, but you actually see an increase in production. So how will climate change impact forage production in the future? Well, it depends. Our outcome through this collaboration, the answer to this question became much more nuanced than we anticipated. So it led to some unanticipated outcomes, what I would say. So this project, though, was part of a larger project, a more ambitious project. What I just talked about was just a bunch of ecologists working together. And I would say we were quite successful. We published nice papers in plant and ecology journals. So as ecologists, we were productive. We did what essentially we were trained to do. But this project that we were working on was actually part of a much larger, had a much larger goal. And it was motivated by working with ecologists and social scientists and range scientists to actually provide resources, information, and strategies to enhance rangeland resilience to climate change. It was more or less conceptualized through this equation. So kind of what I talked about was the exposure and sensitivity. So if you think about climate change, the vulnerability of any system to climate change is a function of how much future climate exposure there is, how much the climate changes, how sensitive that system is to climate change, minus adaptive capacity, so things you can do to increase resilience. So this end was more the ecology end, and then this end was more the social science and range science end. And we thought that this common conceptual idea of resilience, which you might think of the capacity to withstand change or bounce back from disturbance, we thought that was a good sort of umbrella to lead to this interdisciplinary work, where we had ecologists, social scientists, and range scientists working together, and maybe collaborating together can lead to some sort of transdisciplinary outcome, where it's a more holistic perspective on the future of ranching in the Western U.S., really. But it didn't really go as planned, I would say. It didn't operate as nicely as was written in the proposal, the USDA proposal. So what happened was, the ecologists did their job. These are mid-century projections of forage production. We thought we had what we thought was really informative data, or at least projections about, and a story to tell that, the Southwest is in trouble, essentially. It's going to get hotter and drier, and those regions are already on the margins. And our projections show that the Southwest is probably the most vulnerable in terms of, if you just think about forage and weather. And then in parallel, a sub-team of social scientists went out to these different rangelands and they talked to ranchers. And I think this was almost more interesting, talking to people and ranchers and what they think about things. And so there's a lot of quotes, but this was one that I thought was emblematic. You can handle the weather, even the weeds. When you were talking about the weeds, you can spray, you can go out there, and you can do stuff about it. It's the stuff you can't do something about. So these ranchers, they operate in an uncertain environment and deal with weather on a day-to-day basis. What was revealed by the social science component of this was that they care about other things in terms of ranching, economic things, social things, political things. Weather and these ecological things actually did not factor in strongly to their thinking. But really what happened is that we kind of just went in parallel. We talked at each other once in a while, but the team just kind of marched on forward. And there wasn't really much integration. And so we're still trying to make sense of what happened here. And I think one of the important outcomes of this project, this USDA project we did, was trying to reflect on just reflect on the projects. And so Haley Wilmer over at the USDA is kind of leading this synthesis about what we learned as scientists from this project. And so she made this conceptual diagram, and what was interesting is ranchers felt they had more agency about ecological sort of things to enact change in their systems. But as you go to economics and changes in the ranching community and more political and land management, things like that, they felt like they had less control, and that's what they were more concerned about. So I thought that was an interesting insight. There's other things too, such as, they seem to care more about what happens next year than in 50 years. They seem to care more about what happens in their particular system than their ecoregion or region. So there's a lot of interesting things there, but what happened was that we kind of just remained in our disciplinary silos. The ecologists went about what they did. I showed some really nice research published in a nice journal. And the parallel happened for the social science team, but there really wasn't much integration there. So in some ways we were very productive, but I don't know if we really achieved the goal of the proposal to inform resilience strategies for the future of ranching. Like, really, as scientists, we learned a lot about rangelands. I don't know really what we provided to ranchers. So I'm still proud of what we did, but this working together in this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary way, I found was extraordinarily challenging, even for folks that have been doing this for 20 years. I was just a mere postdoc. It seemed like even the senior scientists were challenged by this. So these are, this is from Haley Wilmer. It's just some nice writing she's done in this paper. Even the most skilled team of researchers may struggle to harness the power of transdisciplinary approaches without common intellectual and philosophical motivation, without meaning. So there's probably a lot of reasons why just the idea of resilience wasn't enough to make us really cohesive. I'm not sure we had we had this shared motivation and meaning for the work we were doing. And another nice one here, breaking down disciplinary silos is more than seeing others' perspectives or learning new methods. It's about engaging in scholarship and action as a meaningful responsibility, a relationship to one another, to the systems we depend on. So I'd say, like in this project, we did the first sentence. We learned stuff about others' disciplines, but I'd say we were less successful in the second part. We're still trying to make sense of this project, and it's been interesting. So what have I learned about this so far? Well, I think, no matter what, if you work with other people who have different skills, perspectives, insights, thinking, all these different things, it's going to lead to some sort of creative outcomes. So I think it's almost kind of a inevitable outcome of working with other people. And I found that because the research process, it can be kind of, I don't know how to describe it, nonlinear. It's not just this straight and narrow path. And when you work with other people, you may have an initial goal, but oftentimes what I found is that your work can lead to unintended insights. And moving fully out of your discipline is uncomfortable, and what I found is the tendency is to snap back to working with others you're more comfortable with. So I'm comfortable working with population ecologists and other folks like that, but range scientists and social scientists, that's really challenging. You have to be really intentional about that work. And I also just think that this project, this USDA project I talk about, it was like a 3-year grant, and we proposed to do this whole ambitious thing with this team of 20 people. So, your ambitions have to be matched with the time horizon, I suppose, of what you can even do, your resources. A 3-year grant probably was not enough. You probably need a whole research program built around what that grant was trying to do. So I think for these big teams, which really bridge across truly distinct disciplines, what I found, at least with this project, is that you can fall under the weight of your own ambitions. There still will be good stuff that comes out of it, but you may not achieve what you were originally seeking to achieve. And it does seem that these big projects, truly transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, will be challenged without a shared sense of meaning in the work. So, part of this too, I think, is, these were faculty and research scientists working at, probably working on 5 other projects. And so it's hard to build that shared sense of meaning. Like I think like this project we did was good, but maybe it should be a whole agricultural research science program funded by the USDA, not a 3-year NIFA grant. So it's hard to do that, I think, because everybody's spread so thin. So here are my formal recommendations to no. So, I think it depends on what the goal is. I think for facilitating collaborations with ecologists at that smaller scale, still bounded within that discipline, I think some of the things that are happening that Andy has put forward, I think are good. I think the research development grant brought a lot of people together. It certainly brought me together with faculty. So that was, kind of a common forum for people to get together and think about, this is an opportunity to pursue this project. Would you like to collaborate with me? Because there's money attached to it, people are more likely to do it, not to be cynical, but I think that sort of initiative matches the scope of that, collaborating with other ecologists and having this grant. For more ambitious things, I think you need a long-term vision. That's all I can really say at this point. If you want to truly collaborate across pretty disparate disciplines, I think you need to have a long-term vision and be in it for more than, have your thinking go beyond 2 or 3 years probably. But I don't know, it's really hard, and we're still trying to figure it out from this project, so I don't know. All I can say is that it's hard. So thank you.
Thoughts from folks? Comments?
So you'd like to see maybe an LTER approach for what you were talking about, this resilience, not that it would be a resilience project, but something similar would be long-term research, maybe sponsored by USDA.
Yeah, or long-term agricultural research.
Yeah.
I don't know the amount of resources USDA puts behind that, but yeah, I mean, the LTER sort of structure, yeah, that's great because it's inherently a long-term vision, and I mean, NSF provides $5 million every 5 years, so there's resources behind it. And those sorts of things probably have more buy-in among faculty because they know it's going to build off itself through time and last. I highly doubt, I don't know if they're going to, it's all about like funding and resources, I guess, for like LTR stuff. But yeah, something like that, I think, can help facilitate that because there's a built-in long-term vision to it that I think is distinct from a 2 or 3 year grant that sunsets. So yeah, and I'm born and bred from the LTR. It's my first job was at Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, and I did my PhD at the Konza Prairie. So I kind of know how successful ones look like, and it's really, really, really cool. So something like that, and with the College of Agriculture mini grant, people want to initiate something like that over at Red Bluff. So there are people thinking like that, and yeah. So short answer is yes, something like that. It's just a matter of what it exactly looks like is the question, I guess, at MSU.
Say, folks online, feel free to make comments in the chat box. If you would, Madison, maybe you could monitor those and let us know.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. So thanks. That was a great talk. And I've had a similar experience with big interdisciplinary projects where I feel like we're just working in parallel, but all accomplishing things, in our own particular disciplines. I wonder if that's okay. Or like, what would it look like? What's needed beyond that to have a truly impactful interdisciplinary project?
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's an answer to that.
It could probably looks, there's probably a few different answers to that. So, yeah, I definitely think it's okay. I mean, like in terms of the resources that NIFA gave, I don't know how big the grant was, probably $500,000 or something. I think we got a lot of knowledge creation. We got a lot of professional relationships. It was very productive scientifically. It's just the other end of that, combining those like, very productive on the social sciences, very productive in ecology, blending those to produce something bigger, was where we really struggled. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have a clear answer. I mean, one thing I thought it was like, at least as the ecology part of end of things, I felt very detached from what was the supposed end user. So maybe minimizing that detachment could be good. I like the idea of, for these sorts of things, a knowledge co-production approach where you're working with the stakeholders from the beginning and then they guide the work instead of like, here's what we're going to do, now we'll find the stakeholders. I mean, but all those also might take more than 2 or 3 years because that co-production part is a part of it's building relationships. And relationships, you need trust. And to have trust, you need time. So you need all these things that you don't have in a 2 or 3 year funding cycle. So yeah, I don't know. It's really hard. And I don't know if a 3-year NIFA grant can do that. But I also think it's okay, like what we ended up doing, and we're still thinking about it, and trying to write a paper about, what could be done moving forward. So
Of course, the context is that the big problems that remain out there tend to be the ones that, for which the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary success is required. So to actually improve rangeland management to be resilient to climate change requires the social science and the ecological science coming together. So when you ask, is it valuable to fall short of that? Sure it is, but really the big helps to coping with environmental problems oftentimes means going further and further to do that integration.
Mm-hmm.
And so your comments about how to just recognizing these barriers and the stages and the time scaling and so forth, I think is super relevant to, for example, the research initiatives that have come forward in IOE. I'll come back to that, but I do think it's important to recognize that really going the whole way is tough, but that's what society would most benefit from in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is not totally off, but I was a postdoc too, so I was funded off that grant, and then I went off and did another post. So I went off. I mean, it's just that's a structural thing. Part of the problems that I left to go do another project. So I don't know. That's another piece of it I think about too. Yeah, Bruce.
Yeah, I really like the way you framed the dilemma in many respects, I guess, in terms of how we find that synergy. And I think the comment really is pretty similar to what Wyatt, I think, was pointing out, is that I think it sometimes comes down to this point where as scientists we interact and we can come to some sort of common knowledge, even though we're kind of working in parallel. Mm-hmm. We do find those little intersections often not very synergistic, maybe, or just demonstrating that. But what I find interesting, I guess, or in parallel, is this, and I think you're getting at it, when you moved into this USDA grant, suddenly you're working with people that are thinking about managing landscapes rather than really pure understanding. And rather than using objectivity built into the science, we're using much more experiential approaches, which is trial and error.
Yeah.
I think that's a fundamental difference in thinking. And I think that it's, I don't know, the more I've thought about it, the more I think that's a big part of the issue where we can't seem to transcend into this level of accepting, perhaps, the value in that. And I think partially because we realize that trial and error is really limited by time. And even though we have many ranchers managing the land and they say, we've been managing this for 5 or 6 generations, so we know how the system works, which I find kind of funny, because you can get a very different impression from native folks that have had hundreds, if not thousands of generations to kind of synthesize this, and yet we don't pay much attention at all to that way of knowing.
Right.
And so maybe there's some value in starting to think in those ways in terms of how do we integrate more with that approach, which I think is not actually just trial and error, especially with native folks that showed up on the landscape in a very different way, and they died if they weren't good observers. We thinned out a way of thinking that actually was pretty successful and may have had more objectivity in it than we realized, but it sort of forced objectivity. You died unless you were good at it.
Yeah.
So I think that there's some things like that we could perhaps get at that synergism if we attempt to work into those ways of thinking that bring together the objective approach and the long-term sort of ecological norms that might be in some of our systems that we try to understand.
Sure. Yeah.